Welcome everybody and thank you for joining our session today at the Faith Pavilion in the Blue Zone at COP29. A very warm welcome to those joining us online. And our topic today is urbanization in Asia and how we can overcome barriers and scale urban nature-based solutions. My name is Najma Mohammed. I'm from UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, a specialist research center on biodiversity, and I'm the head of nature-based solutions there, so I have the real pleasure of working at the intersection of the nature, climate, and people agenda. So before I welcome the fantastic lineup of panelists that will be joining me in conversation today, on the fireside chat, so hopefully it will get real cozy and honest and open about the real challenges that we face. I do have the opportunity to help set the scene for the conversation here today. And I think often we want to look at the challenges that cities as, a concentration of people, but also the concentration of really good ideas and the opportunity to innovate and try new things. I think cities, in a sense, represent a microcosm of some of the really difficult challenges we face globally, of how to bring the most marginalized, those who are facing the brunt of climate change, into the solutions that we are putting together. So it's a real pleasure to be able to set the scene and try to bring us onto a positive note as we're coming into the really difficult moments at COP29, where we're working, I think, incredibly hard from morning till night to reach a fair agreement on how we will finance the urgent climate action that we need. So we know that currently, more than half of humanity live in cities. And if, like me, you're living in a coastal city, I'm sure many of us do. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa, currently based in the UK where my organization is based. But by 2050, we're expecting that probably over 9 billion people will be living in cities across the world. Cities produce 80% of global GDP. So as I said, they are real centers of innovation and economic activity, but they use 70% of the world's resources to do that, and they emit 70% of emissions. So cities will be critical in helping the world achieve our international commitments that we're making on nature, on climate change, on the sustainable development goals. But cities also face unprecedented challenges. By 2050, climate change is likely to place at least 570 coastal cities, that's over 800 million people, at risk from a wide range of challenges such as sea level rise, storm surges, and unsustainable urbanization practices still continue, while many millions of city dwellers across the world still lack access to basic services like shelter, like access to clean water and adequate food. So as city and state governments are thinking about urban development and ways to make themselves more resilient, we also find that cities don't experience these impacts equally. Cities in the global south, and that is what we're going to be speaking about today, we're going to be focusing on cities in Asia, face an additional vulnerability. They just have 70% of the cooling capacity that other cities in the global north have, because they don't have the same amount of greenery and open spaces to support the sort of intense heat. Each year, an estimated 46 million people in cities are at risk of flooding from storm surges in East Asia alone. Some of Asia's fastest growing cities are susceptible to climate impacts such as sea level rise. We know, for example, cities like Dhaka in Bangladesh has been affected by 9 major floods in the past 55 years. So we have very vulnerable residents, and we know that in many of these cities, to bring it even closer to home, as I mentioned, cities often are a microcosm of what we see in the world with very vulnerable groups, and we know that informal settlement dwellers or slum dwellers often have very little coping capacity. They are often under the radar of the government services, early warning systems, the system to be able to mobilize action and to be able to move fast in the face of these extreme events. So we are dealing with incredible vulnerability. Urban nature-based solutions, if we come out to a really positive sort of focus, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the panelists, have a really key role in helping to create more climate resilient cities. But the beauty, and I think the privilege of working on integrated solutions like nature-based solutions, is that it helps us to actually tackle these challenges in an integrated way, because people don't experience climate, nature and development challenges separately. They experience it collectively. They experience it in the form of health risks, risk of not being able to access adequate food and shelter and clean water. And so integrating nature and nature-based solutions into urban resilience planning provides benefits like climate adaptation, but also improved air and water quality, access to food, lowering temperatures, making life more livable, job creation, and recreational and open space opportunities that as many cities closed down, we actually experienced the mental health benefits of living in cities that had green open spaces during the lockdown that many countries experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So when cities have the tools actually to begin to integrate nature into their development planning, into their budgeting, they can become powerful engines of change and innovation, and actually for, I think, both a nature positive and a climate resilient future. This is an area of work for my organization, and I'm also really looking forward to learn from and collaborate with the colleagues that are going to be speaking here today. So to accommodate our online audience as well, and so we can really have our speakers' contributions visible, I'm going to introduce the panelists and then ask you just to come up one by one to make your intervention before we settle down into our fireside chat and have a much more interactive discussion. So Dr. Henry Neufeld, he leads UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center's work on climate risk, nature-based solutions and transparency in adaptation. He's the chief scientific editor of the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, and really that was one of my most difficult moments at COP29. Not because you delivered the message in a difficult or not understandable way, but because you delivered it in such an understandable way that it was terrifying. You know, to see the gap we have. You brought also the challenges really home to who will be impacted, by, the climate risks that we are facing. And I both want to thank you and also tell you I don't know how you cope as a scientist working with that numbers, knowing that there are people and lives behind those numbers. So thank you, Henry. I'm really looking forward to your intervention. Joining us after Henry will be Charu Lata. So Charu, I'll do the introduction now and then invite you to come up later. She leads the work on clean energy at the Natural Resource Defense Council in India. In addition to accelerating the productive use of clean energy, Charu also focuses on the deployment of nature-based solutions such as cool roofs for thermal comfort and sustainable agricultural practices. Charu, really excited to hear about your work and some of the national level examples. Then we will have Patricia Gradnani, a postdoc researcher at the University of Southern Denmark. Patricia is part of the UNESCO Chair on Urban Resilience at the University of Southern Denmark, and her research focuses on multi-level climate governance and the urban-related content in the nationally determined contributions. Henry, you take the floor first.
Thank you so much, Najma, for that kind introduction, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about some of the results that we have in the Adaptation Gap Report this year, because they are connected to urban adaptation action, and some of this is also connected to nature-based solutions. So I'll use that in the later part. I'll just start my intervention. I don't know if you could bring up the slides, please. No, that's not quite there yet. Is there a clicker here somewhere? Okay. Oh. Okay. Sorry. Nobody told me. Here we go. Yes, so I think Najma already did everything that I can possibly talk about. I can just add a few more details, maybe. So Asia is warming faster than the global average. And the trend has nearly doubled since the period 1961 to 1990. And just these four headlines here show the extent of the climate impacts that we're currently facing, particularly in Asia, where there is a significantly lower capacity to deal with climate impacts. So when floods hit, when there's heat waves, there are more casualties in Asia particularly than anywhere else in the world. So it's one of the most vulnerable regions that we know of in the world. So Asia, alongside Africa and Latin America, at the forefront of world's urbanization as well, and Najma was talking about that already, like the drive to move into urban centers is strongest in Asia also. And there are already 4.8 billion people living in urban areas today, and that's going to increase in the next 20, 30 years until we peak in terms of the population, the global population. So some of these Asian cities are going to be the most densely inhabited places in the world, and at the same time it's also the most disaster hit region in the world with regard to extreme weather events. But then there's also the coastal hazards in terms of sea level rise, salinization, and other impacts that these regions are facing. And that means more people exposed to climate hazards, vulnerable people exposed to climate hazards. We're talking about significant loss of lives, loss of livelihoods, and economic damages and losses. Adaptation is absolutely crucial to address these issues. Now we're talking about nature-based solutions here, and from our gap report, the adaptation gap report, this year we produced a focus on urban adaptation for the first time. And the two major hazards that cities deal with all over the world in every single regional area that we look at, global regions, flooding and heat are the two biggest climate hazards that we're dealing with. And this figure here shows you, now this brings me to the connection to nature-based solutions. What you can see here is the region around Istanbul, a big city, and that's where it's red. It's the urban areas there, that's heat. The blue areas in the vicinity, that's the surrounding temperature. At the same time, for basically green spaces that are surrounding the urban centers that we're looking at. This is not a large scale. So what we can see here, that nature-based solutions have a high potential to deliver these benefits in terms of heat reduction, flood and stormwater management, coastal protection. When we look at mangroves one way, or like wetlands and salt marshes in less tropical regions, drought reduction and landslide risk reduction. So these are direct benefits that nature-based solutions provide if we implement them. And then there are major co-benefits connected to nature-based solutions. Social, environmental, economic. There's job creation connected to them. There's the social benefits of providing more livable spaces. And there's health-related co-benefits. There's benefits connected to biodiversity and ecosystem services. So investing in nature in urban contexts is something that pays off economically, but there's also challenges in getting there. When we look at this figure here, we can see that most of this is reflecting, it reflects the fact that 80% of the member countries in the Asian region have I don't quite understand this figure right now, but what we can see here on the far left side is that the temperatures, this was the same, it's basically the same picture that I showed before, that the temperatures, day and night temperatures, are lowest in the vicinities of urban areas and highest in the urban areas. Sorry. Let me just come to this last slide here, which was where I was going with regards to the barriers of investing in nature. This figure is from the World WWF, and it shows that our objective, that is effective and scalable nature-based solutions that provide resilient and connected ecosystems, For them to function, we need systemic enablers, inclusive governance, smart spatial planning, and progressive economic and financial regulation. These are three systemic enablers that we need to have in order for nature-based solutions to work at any scale. But we need to overcome some of the barriers that are, you can see at the bottom line here, which are the places we find ourselves in most often today. Insufficient recognition of rights, indigenous peoples' rights, missing social incentives to invest in nature solutions. Then we also have institutional challenges connected to conflicting policy frameworks. Because nature hasn't been considered in the past, our regulations are focused on gray infrastructure, on solutions that are built around engineering. And we need to change that in order for nature-based solutions to become more widely used and acceptable. There are also structural barriers, limited governance capacity, and corruption, which is very often, unfortunately, the case in developing countries. So these are things that need to be improved. Accountability, transparency, and collaboration with stakeholders on the ground are critical. And then there's economic barriers, like undervaluing natural capital. There is a strong value in nature, and it's often not considered in our budgets, in our economic systems. That needs to change. There's insufficient or poorly directed finance. That means we need to redirect capital to invest more strongly in nature. And last but not least, there's a limited direct financial revenue problem. And I was already talking about the fact that investing in nature has high upfront costs and some maintenance costs before we can see the benefits of nature investments. And to overcome this time lag, which we always face when we invest in nature, requires blended finance, it requires public-private partnerships that enable to de-risk investments for private sector. And I'm going to stop here because others have really important things to say as well. Thank you.
You're much taller than me, Henry. Let's get this to my level. I mean, I think it's amazing. We all came to this COP, I think, with the money COP, right? The finance COP. But I think what I really, I think one of the key reflections for me from your presentation, Henry, is that you really outlined the importance of these enabling factors: planning, policy and regulation, governance, and money. But I think if we don't actually fund and cost those means of implementation, we are always going to say we need the means of implementation to be able to do the climate action. I think the other sort of really thing that stuck in my mind as you were speaking about the importance of bringing in ecological design and natural capital accounting and the understanding of the wealth of nature in a city planning context is I think we actually need to start training our engineers in a different way. So hopefully, we're beginning to hear a lot more. Maybe Patricia, you can reflect on that when it's your turn to come up. So Charu, I'll hand over to you now to share with us a bit more about your work in India and some of the barriers, opportunities that you see around nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Najma. Thank you for inviting me for this very, very important and very timely discussion on nature-based solutions and their importance across cities in Asia. I'll be talking, a little bit more about extreme heat and urban cooling, the work that we do at NRDC in India. Extreme heat, as Professor Henry also pointed, Asia is warming much faster than the global average. A very, very good example of this is India. This year we saw that India had one of the longest and one of the most severe heat spells that actually lasted 40 days during the summer season. This was also the most severe if we look at it from the past 75 years. So the heat really shot up. In some states like Uttar Pradesh or Rajasthan, temperatures went up to 50 degrees centigrade, and these were almost 5 to 6 degrees more than the nominal temperatures that the cities see in those states. If we also see, globally in the last 5 decades, heat wave events have shot up like anything. There have been almost more than 700 heat wave events across the world, and their rate has increased in the past few years. This is also leading a lot to heat related mortalities across countries, and India has seen that as well in this summer. What NRDC has been working on, since almost a decade now, uh, to help the city governments, the state governments, not just prepare for these heat events, but also adapt to them. And how can state governments, city governments do that? Currently in India, if you see, almost 100 cities have heat action plans. So the work has really picked up. It has scaled, which is amazing to see. But there are a bunch of challenges also that I'll allude to. So the heat action plan that we are doing in India, one is helping and working with the state governments, city governments to draft these action plans. Second is working with the government officials to build their capacity, not just at the national level, but also at the state and the city level, because we see that technical expertise capacity is lacking. So working with the government to build their capacity. And third is actually on implementation of these solutions. A very good example of this is in one of the cities in the state of Rajasthan, which actually experiences the highest temperature in India. The city is called Jodhpur. We recently developed a sustainable cooling center. This center essentially is built with all the natural ingredients, natural materials, and has thatched walls. It has mist fans. It has solar panels to power the center, and the temperature inside the center essentially is 5 to 6 degrees lesser than the ambient temperature outside. Really helps the communities to come in, sit, relax, and it's again managed by the community and the local authorities. So getting that local buy-in as well as we are implementing solutions on the ground. Another work that NRDC has been doing, and this is something again that's picking up in India, is on cool roofs or green roofs. So we worked very closely with the state government of Telangana in coming up with the first state level policy in India on cool roofs, and this has a big component on green roofs as well. So how do you provide thermal comfort while reducing the demand for electricity and demand for cooling within existing buildings? Uh, Uttar Pradesh, another state that experiences a lot of heat, is now working on designing an urban cooling policy, a statewide urban cooling policy that they are planning to launch in some time, and again focusing on urban cooling solutions. So there are examples that we see in India, across states, a lot of action happening at the state and the city level to address extreme heat and come up with sustainable cooling solutions. But like I said, there are challenges that we've encountered in the 10-year journey that we've had. First is that heat is not recognized as a disaster in India. So a few states have started doing that recently. We are working with the national government also at the state and the city level to recognize heat as a disaster. We also saw that there is very limited institutional capacity, both in terms of number of how do I say, government people that are available to work on this, and also the expertise that they have. So, building that expertise is something that we see is a gap, and we need to work on that. Uh, Local vulnerability assessment is also something that we saw was a big challenge, because when you work on nature-based solutions, like the solution that could work in one city might not be applicable to another city. So we need to have these local vulnerability assessments to understand what kind of solutions could be applicable to each of the cities. while developing those solutions, we also saw that there are a lot of budgetary constraints. Cities do not have the funds to actually implement these solutions. So how do we work around those? And I think one thing that we saw in general across cities and states was interdepartmental coordination. This is one topic wherein a lot of different departments need to come together, be it forestry or urban development or water or health. So bringing them all on the same page to ensure that the programs that are being launched by the state government or the city government, they are all aligned and they are aligned with the nature-based solutions that the cities are trying to implement, will make a lot of difference. With this, I'll rest my initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charu. That were excellent interventions. You really just brought it to life, brought to home, some of the really systemic levers that Henry started us off with, looking at the policies and the plans, but then also coming to the barriers of how do we finance that. I'd love to explore when we get to the fireside chat, how you get the planners and the open space, the spatial planning and the financial planning and the budgeting all, aligned. Patricia, I hand over to you for your opening remarks now, where I really look forward to hearing about the frameworks that have been developed under the auspices of the chair that you are a part of.
Yes, thank you, Najma, for your introduction. And I'm here representing the UNESCO Chair on Urban Resilience at the University of Southern Denmark. And today I will talk about the urban-related content in the nationally determined contributions. So I will first give you an overview on this, and then we will look at nature-based solutions specifically. So this report, actually, that you see on the screen is the product of a collaboration with UN Habitat and UNDP. And this is what I will present today. So in this report, we've looked at how NDCs are mentioned in cities and the urban sector in general, and we've analyzed this through a system of roughly 200 indicators. So these 200 indicators look at mitigation and adaptation challenges and responses at the national level and at the urban level in the NDCs. And we've also looked at cross-cutting issues and climate hazards. So based on the level of the urban content in the NDC, we've clustered NDCs into 3 clusters, which are those that you see on the screen. So we have cluster A, which are NDCs that have a strong level of urban content and clearly identify cities as a national priority for climate action. We have cluster B, which are NDCs that have a moderate level of urban content. So they do have identified challenges and responses for mitigation and adaptation at the urban level, but they don't really state that cities are a priority for climate action. And lastly, we have cluster C, which are NDCs that do not have any related content to cities and the urban sector. So I'll give you a few seconds to look at the map. The dark color represents NDCs with strong urban content. So these NDCs declare that cities and the urban sector in general are a national priority for climate action. The medium blue represents NDCs that have a moderate urban content, and lastly, the light color is NDCs that do not have any content related to cities. As you can see, NDCs that have a strong focus on cities are 27% of all NDCs. 39% is NDCs that have a moderate urban-related content. 35% of NDCs don't have anything related to cities. So let's give a look to urban mitigation specifically. If we look at the map, the dark color here represents NDCs that have urban mitigation content, whether it's challenges or responses. And the light color is NDCs that don't have anything related to urban climate mitigation. If we look at the chart here with the bars, these are the most frequently mentioned sectors when it comes to urban climate mitigation. As we can see, we have energy, we have waste, we have transport and mobility, which are the most frequently mentioned sectors. You can clearly see in the chart that the NDCs tend to list responses, so projects, initiative, actions, more frequently than challenges. This is positive on one side. We want to see NDCs coming with solutions, but we would like them to also clearly identify the challenge that they are trying to target. And this is not really visible in the NDCs as responses are mentioned more frequently than challenges. This is true also for adaptation. Here, once again, the dark color in the map represents NDCs that have urban-related content for adaptation. Light color NDCs that don't have anything related to urban adaptation. In the bar chart, once again, we see the most frequently mentioned sectors, which are water, which are infrastructure, and others. Again, responses, so actions are listed more frequently than challenges. So there is not a clear identification of the challenge that the NDC wants to address. Another thing that we looked at in this report is cross-cutting issues, means of implementation, and climate hazards. So among the cross-cutting issues that we've looked at, there is, for example, informal settlement, data availability for mitigation and adaptation, civic participation, multi-level governance, loss and damage, innovation, youth, indigenous people, knowledge and practice, social inclusion, circular economy, public spaces, gender, nature-based solutions, and ecosystem services. As you can see in the bar chart here, the full color represents a national mention. So we have quite some NDCs that mention cross-cutting issues, but not so many mention cross-cutting issues at the urban level. We then looked at means of implementation, so finance, technology, and capacity building. So we looked at how NDCs mention these means of implementation for the actions that they are listing. As you can see, for example, we have 141 NDCs that mention finance as a general measure, so at the national level. Not so many mention it at the urban level. We have 160 NDCs that mention technology, and 155 mention capacity building. Once again, at the urban level, there is not much content here. If we look at the climate hazards that are mentioned in the NDCs, we can clearly see that, for example, floods, droughts, temperature rise, coastal erosion, and heat waves are frequently mentioned in the NDCs, but once again, not so much at the urban level. And we've seen with the previous speakers that these climate hazards are very important at the urban level. They spoke about floods, droughts, erosion, saline water intrusion, but not all of these are correctly reflected in the NDCs, at least at the urban level. So an important tool that we have included in this report is these country fishes. These are basically a visual representation that gives to the reader the chance to have a quick overview on the content on the NDCs, both at the national and at the urban level, and also the cluster that has been assigned to each NDC. So here I brought as an example China and Bangladesh. As you can see, China is in cluster A because it clearly identifies cities as a national priority for climate action, and it also has a series of provisions both at the national and at the urban level for all the different sectors. It also has a little bit of climate hazards. Bangladesh, on the other side, is in the cluster of moderate urban content. So it does have some provisions here and there for cities, but it does not see cities as a national priority for climate action. So let's look at NBS specifically. So we know that the theme of today's event is nature-based solutions in Asia, and nature-based solution was one of our cross-cutting indicators for the analysis of NDCs. So if we look at the map, the orange content represents NDCs that mention nature-based solutions at the national level. We then have the yellow color, which here is represented only by South Korea. There are NDCs that mention nature-based solution at the urban level. And lastly, the blue color is NDCs that mention nature-based solutions both at the national and at the urban level. And sadly, this is only Jordan, Malaysia, and Myanmar. So this is food for thought because we have seen with the previous speaker the potential that nature-based solutions have to address climate hazards and also to support adaptation. But this is not reflected once again in the NDCs. Not many of them mention nature-based solution. Not many of them mention nature-based solution at the local level specifically. So the report comes to an end with a series of recommendations to enhance the urban-related content in the NDCs. We've mentioned, like you've mentioned it, Charu, like the importance of vertical and horizontal policy integration, multi-level governance. This is also reflected in our report. We have plenty of recommendations, which right now we don't have time to go through all of them, but you can see the report yourself. Other relevant related work is this publication, which is Urban Climate Action Policy Brief series with the Global Green Growth Institute. We are also having some sectoral focus, for example, with UNESCO IHP. We have a report dedicated to urban water content in the NDCs. And lastly, we are working at guidelines to support parties in increasing the urban-related content in the NDCs, and this will be published in probably Q1 of next year. And then we have a fourth publication, that is coming out, which is related to urban climate finance, and this one is with GCOM. If you would like to have more information about this report, you can scan the QR code, and it will lead you to the UN Habitat link. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrizia. I think we've had some really rich interventions from all three of our panelists, and I will invite you to join me in front now for what we hope will be a nice, cozy fireside chat for us to begin to pick up on some of the real key messages that have come out from your interventions, but also some really powerful messages coming out from your presentation, Patrizia. We are, I think, now weeks, months maybe away from the deadline for submissions of NDC 3.0 and 12 recommendations you didn't quite get to, so hopefully we'll have a time now to speak to them. Let me start with the NDC 3.0. We are, as I said, by the 10th of February, parties are expected to submit and have readied their nationally determined contributions. 3.0, building on the findings of the global stocktake, building on the insights and the lessons that have come from all the scientific analysis that we have available. And it was quite shocking, Patrizia, when you did say that it seems that the nationally determined contributions don't reflect the climate vulnerability and the priorities of countries. If half of humanity is living in cities, not seeing that urban focus in nationally determined contributions can be quite worrying. You and I didn't plan it, but we both spoke about Bangladesh, didn't we? And I spoke about Dhaka, and saying that this is a city that has, faced floods, devastating floods over the last 50 years. So perhaps before we go into our formal question, and if the three of you don't mind, can we have a sort of a lightning round of responses as to what you think NDC 3.0 should, what is the ambition that we want in there for us to be able to respond better to integrating urban nature-based solutions into those plans? Henry, shall we start with you?
Okay, thank you. I wasn't expecting this kind of question, so but my first thought obviously is that the NDCs need to be much more ambitious than they currently are. That's a reflection that should reflect much more strongly on mitigation, on adaptation. And just to follow up on what Patrizia was saying here, I think providing more connection to urban and subnational action is quite important as well. So I'm hoping that the NDCs that we come to see will have integrated, because it's the third iteration of NDCs, learning from previous rounds of NDCs. There's a lot that we can improve in the quality of the response to the climate challenge, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation and the integration of them. And the responses have to include nature-based solutions much more strongly than they currently do. I'll stop here, but there's a lot to say.
Yes, I agree with what you said. So when it comes to the ambition or the improvement that we would like to see in the next round of NDCs, so NDCs 3.0, definitely we want to see a higher inclusion of cities, not only in terms of content, but also in terms of participatory processes. For instance, some NDCs mention these processes in the text. Others don't refer to that at all. So we are, as I mentioned, we are now drafting a number of recommendations and guidelines for parties to increase the ambition, and especially the urban-related ambition in their NDCs. I think there's a lot of work to do, and it is surprising that given that a significant portion of the global population lives in cities, cities contribute to climate change with emission and so on. So it is surprising that they are not as included as one would expect in the NDCs. But I have high hopes that at the next COP we will see a significant improvement. I really hope so, because this is necessary. It definitely is.
Thank you. This is definitely an interesting question. I think I agree with both the speakers. We need to up the ambition on the NDCs that are about to come out in 2 months' time, 3 months' time. But one thing, coming from India that I would like to point out is in global south, we still have a lot of population that lives in rural areas. So though I know we are talking about, urban cities and urban centers, but we have to understand that the city boundaries are going to expand going forward. There are going to be peri-urban areas that will eventually convert to urban areas. So while we are talking about nature-based solutions, we have to ensure that they just don't apply to cities. They also apply to some extent to the rural and peri-urban areas, because people eventually will move from rural to peri-urban to urban. And while we are talking about NDCs, I think we need to ensure that the NDCs that come out are more inclusive. They do include the vulnerable populations. They do include the challenges that women face, and include everyone in this energy or climate transition that we all are going through and we all are planning for. So yeah.
Thank you, Henry. I think you've been here very long, but you said something at an earlier panel that had stuck with me. You said a lot that stuck with me this week, some really difficult things. As I said, you the adaptation gap report, you're the lead scientist on that report, but you said that they have to be strategic and they have to speak to the priorities that all three of you outlined incredibly well today. But I think we also have to bear in mind that the nationally determined contributions are our commitments. But it's the planning, it's the heat plans that bring them to life. It's the local city level planning. And I think I come from a city that faces a lot of challenges. I come from Cape Town, South Africa. And my city had, not a futuristic scenario, but a scenario that we faced not so long ago, of a day when a city that has to give water to 11 million people was going to run out of water. And we were counting down days, 17 days, 16 days. We kept pushing it back, not because it rained. Thankfully, it did rain after that, and the situation is better. But because there was collective action, and everyone, contributed. Government, civil society, local people. We had the Faith Pavilion. Faith leaders were preaching from the pulpits, from the mosques. You've got to save water. This is something we all depend upon. So that collective action at city level, where there's often, strong social capital, in these, places that are not that easy to live in, that we actually then realize how incredible it is that we actually go for collective action. So now I will stick to script and ask you all the questions that you have been asked to respond to. And that is really how we can begin to integrate financing for urban nature-based solutions into, the kind of plans that are going to give life and breathe life into the nationally determined contributions. So are you okay to start, Henry? Should we start on that side? Let's go.
I can start. I do have some examples to share from India, how we're doing it. I was earlier talking about the heat action plans, and like I said, city governments do not have a lot of funds to actually support these nature-based solutions that we talked about today. What we are trying to do is, for example, we are working with the national government, the National Disaster Management Authority in India, to notify heat as a disaster. Now, NDMA has a fund for disaster risk mitigation. If heat is notified as a disaster nationally, the states are going to adopt it. And then, a chunk of that fund can be utilized for such solutions. Because all these solutions do fall under the heat action plans that the cities are implementing. So trying to do that. Another thing that we are trying to do is, when we are building these heat action plans, we have to realize it's not that the funding is not there. The funding is actually there. It's lying with other departments. It is available for similar interventions. So how do we bring together these departments? Maybe forestry has some funding for planting trees, or agriculture has some funding for sustainable agricultural practices. So how do we ensure that the interventions that we are putting down in our plan are integrated with the programs and policies that the cities and states already have, so that they are able to tap into that funding? A lot of the times we prepare our program, we don't see what's already out there, and we forget to tap into it. So I think it's very important to tap into the existing funding. And I have another example. I talked about the cool roof policy that we developed with the state of Telangana. So in India, private corporates above a certain size are supposed to put 2% of their funds as CSR funds. Now, what we are trying to do is we worked with the state government to include green roofing, cool roofing as one of the priority solutions under CSR for the state. Now, whichever company wants to actually give out funds, CSR funds, to the state government for implementation, a chunk of it can go to nature-based solutions. So, trying out different ways to include nature-based solutions into the financial kitties that are already available. I think we're trying to do that, and it's working in certain cases. So, yeah.
The question was examples.
Also, thank you, Patricia. So the question was examples that you'd like to share, but also how you believe that urban nature-based solutions can be financed, because we certainly heard they can contribute to the challenges that cities face. How do we think they can be financed in a more strategic, systematic way? I think we had some wonderful examples from you. Is that we know that the funding for climate action is not going to be sufficient, and we know that urban nature-based solutions can speak to exactly the mandate that other city-level departments hold: disaster risk reduction, food issues, water issues, health. Health is a big one. How do we tap into those budgets and begin to see the fact that investing in nature can deliver those critical outcomes that cities need to deliver for their growing populations?
Okay, so financing nature-based solutions at the urban level. So I think, as Charu mentioned, like public-private partnership can be one answer, and I'm not a finance specialist here, but I think it would be very important to highlight the cost of inaction, which is what we will try to do. Like, we have seen that, for instance, in the NDCs, there is not much finance, technology, and capacity building allocated to urban interventions. So what we would like to do next is trying to estimate the cost of inaction. Okay, so if you country don't do anything about climate change at the urban level, you might suffer this financial loss in the future. So I think this might help at least to stimulate action. And then, like, when it comes to examples of nature-based solutions in the NDCs, I brought some examples here. So just as a reminder, 39% of Asian NDCs mention nature-based solutions. And for example, Myanmar mentions nature-based solution as a way to reduce heat island, which is what you mentioned too. And then we have Japan, for example, that mentions nature-based solution as a way to support and create a new industry and green jobs, which is a very hot topic too, green jobs. We have Jordan that talks about nature-based solution to protect ecosystem and habitats. Malaysia talks about nature-based solution to increase climate resilience of cities and mediate the effects of climate change. And Sri Lanka, for example, mentions nature-based solution to protect against natural disasters, so landslides, floods, droughts, coastal erosion. And lastly, Turkey mentions it as a way to protect landscapes.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Henry, you can respond to the question on financing urban NBS, but I also wonder, how do we bring this climate and nature agenda together at the urban level? We've been seeing it all over COP29. We're talking about climate-nature synergies. We hope that we will get it right operationally to have the different Rio conventions speak to one another and find a collective way to look at these challenges. We know at country level there are all types of discussions happening to find out how, between the nationally determined contributions and the national biodiversity strategy and action plans, that there's coordination and coherence and synergies. But at city level, what are the opportunities to actually bring those two big agendas together?
Yeah, it's a great question, I think. And evidently, we're facing a triple crisis here, which we can't solve on our own. Like the climate crisis can't be solved without solving the nature crisis, without solving the crisis of land degradation. So the three conventions actually speak to one big problem that we can only look at in an integrated way. And we can look at this at the rural areas where it's important, but also, and this is maybe even more important because so many people live in cities and more people will end up living in cities, that we need to find solutions at that scale as well. And I think nature-based solutions are just it's just so clear that they provide benefits in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation, biodiversity, ecosystem services in general. So investing in them provides all these economic benefits that Patricia was just talking about, quantifying what would be the case of inaction versus the case of doing something. Now we have the solutions also in terms of engineering opportunities, gray infrastructure. And I've been saying this a lot of times. Investment in gray infrastructure and nature-based solutions follows a very different temporal timeline or temporal pattern. That's a better word. Because you can provide gray infrastructure to address climate hazards and you produce the benefits instantaneously. So you invest in your gray infrastructure, a flood wall or something like that, you will have the benefit of that protection instantaneously as soon as it's produced. That is not the case for nature-based solutions. So because they take time to develop, it takes time for these solutions to provide the benefits that they deliver in the end and that we expect of them. And because of this different cash flow relationship in terms of investment, it's really difficult for the private sector to come on board, at least under the conditions that we've created for ourselves over the past 50 or 100 years. Our regulations are all designed for gray infrastructure, for solutions that do not include nature. And we need to change that. And we can change that. And I think there is a growing recognition of the benefits that nature provides. Then there is a need to blend finance in the sense that in order for the private sector to invest in nature, we need to de-risk the investments because otherwise the private sector will not go there. It's just too risky. Very often, I mean, solutions can be cheap, but still, very often they are considered risky because they do not provide the kind of returns on investment that the private sector requires for engaging in any kind of solution. And again, the public sector is demanded here to provide the framework within which the private sector can operationalize and invest more strongly in nature and other solutions. So I'm not a fan of saying only nature is the solution. I think hybrid solutions very often provide the kind of response that we need, immediate protection against climate impacts, but also long-term benefits through nature, finding ways to combine these things and doing so in ways that involve the population living in these spaces is so critical. I mean, we've been looking at some cases in Asia, in India in particular, and we can see that the value of property that is in greener spaces is so much higher than the value of property in gray spaces. And that is a question of gentrification, that is a question of social justice. So when we invest in areas, we try to regenerate urban infrastructure and provide green spaces, this 330-300 rule, for instance, that's been provided here. That comes at a cost. It requires removing gray spaces in exchange for green spaces, and that comes at the cost, particularly for the lower income populations. And so if we do not pay attention, people will be expropriated, they will have to leave to the parts of the city that are less, that's not where they come from. So they're going to be removed from their homes, from their neighborhoods, from their livelihoods particularly. And I think we need to be careful when we invest in nature that we take climate justice into account to make sure that these negative effects do not happen. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Henry. I think we do not have much time unless anyone has a burning question from the audience. I think, Henry, you've hit the nail on, and I've kept myself back as someone that's working on nature-based solutions because all of you have had such fantastic contributions. But one of the big concerns around nature-based solutions is exactly what you've just said now, is green grabbing. That what we could end up doing is actually trying to get back land for nature, get back land for the really important services that nature can give us, but at the expense of those who cannot, maybe afford to be close to those nature. And nature-based solutions, very clearly in the multilaterally agreed definition on nature-based solutions, must be delivered with ecological integrity. So they have to be designed on the best ecological knowledge and principles that we have, and on social integrity, leaving no one behind and respecting the rights of local people, indigenous communities to be part of the decision-making processes, part of the design, and part of the solutions, because often they know, best. What they're experiencing, and as we've heard now, it's not impacts that will be experienced in a decade or more. It's already being experienced in cities and with city dwellers across the world. So I will wrap up and say a very big thank you to all of you. I think my knowledge and understanding of cities has grown immensely. Patrizia, that was a really valuable report, and I hope we can bring that slide up again so that all of us who are working on nature-based solutions, hoping and working for more ambitious nationally determined contributions, come early 2025, we'll begin to see a much bigger part for cities and urban nature-based solutions within those NDCs. I think to end on a sort of a sobering note from my side is that our current climate policies will leave more than a fifth of humanity exposed to dangerously hot temperatures. And the largest at-risk populations, as we heard from Charu, from Patrizia, from Henry, will be in cities where most of humanity is already living and will be living. So cities must be at the center of our global climate commitments and plans because they are facing, critical threat. They need to progress on net zero targets, but at the same time, they also need to make the city more resilient, and we know and heard very eloquently from the panel, thank you, on the role that nature can play in that. And I would like to finish off with an area that's very close to my heart and my work for the last 20 years, working on nature and climate. But actually climate justice, as you so well said, Henry, must be central to urban climate action, especially for informal settlement and slum dwellers who are the most vulnerable in the cities in the global south. And we will hear it, and we know, Patrizia, the figure for just transition within NDCs is pretty much as grim as it is for cities. We don't have just transition considerations clearly integrated in the NDCs. We hope for stronger city focus, a stronger people focus in the next round of NDCs. And we hope for a just, urban climate transition, especially structural vulnerabilities are addressed and are central to climate action and plans in the upcoming nationally determined contributions. Thank you for those of you who've joined us here today, and those joining online. I hope that you enjoyed this stimulating and enriching discussion as much as I did. Thank you to the panelists.
But very nice. Very nice.